Brian was stuck in the grind, slogging through yet another miserable day at a thankless job for a company he couldn't care less about. Staring into the mirror, he found himself wondering what had happened to the tall, dark guy from high school and college. He wasn't exactly handsome back then, but he was at least decent looking. Now, his hairline was retreating, his waistline was expanding, and his energy levels were almost non-existent. The only thing keeping him going was the love of his family, his wife, Heather, and their two boys, Ross and Jason. Without them, he wasn't sure how he'd cope. At 6 feet tall, though often slumped under the weight of his responsibilities, and just over 205 pounds, he wasn't in terrible shape, just nowhere near the fit cross-country runner he once was. His 70-hour work weeks were draining him, slowly wearing him down. It was taking a toll on his body, but seeing the happiness on his family's faces when he could provide for them made it feel, somehow, worth the pain. It was Friday, and the thought of the weekend kept him going as he navigated the bumper-to-bumper traffic. He couldn't wait to spend time with his kids and Heather. What had him truly excited, though, was the prospect of a better future. An old college buddy had reached out to him recently, proposing that Brian come on board as a partner in his business. It wouldn't mean more hours than he was already putting in, but it would mean better pay, a partner's share of the profits instead of just a salary. At last, there seemed to be a flicker of light at the end of the tunnel. The drive that should have taken 20 minutes stretched into an hour and a half, thanks to a traffic accident. But when Brian finally pulled into his driveway, he sighed in relief. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and let his mind drift through the memories of years gone by. In high school, Brian wasn't exactly a stellar student, more like a slacker. If he could get a B by doing the bare minimum, why would he bother working hard for an A? By the time college rolled around, his options were limited. He could either go to the State University College at Rockford, SUCR, pronounced sucker with an exclamation point, naturally, or maybe look into trade schools. He opted for SUCR. For the first 2 years, Brian drifted through college, not taking anything seriously. It was like an extension of his high school slacking. But then, 2 pivotal things happened. First, he enrolled in an introductory electronics course. One day, the professor handed out an article written by a friend of his who worked at EMI Company. The article discussed a new development in the medical field, something called a computerized axial tomography, CAT, scan machine. The CAT scan merged X-ray technology with the emerging field of microcomputers, using multiple X-rays to create cross-sectional images of the body that could be viewed in 3D on a screen. Well, Brian was fascinated. After the class, he bombarded the professor with questions. Eventually, to get some peace, the professor promised to introduce Brian to his friend at EM1. That was the moment Brian knew he'd found his calling. The second life-changing moment came when he met Heather. Running late for class, Brian had barreled through the doors of the English department and accidentally knocked over a young woman, sending her flying backwards several feet. She hit the ground hard, unconscious. For a terrifying moment, Brian thought he had killed her. Luckily, Heather recovered, and, as fate would have it, she didn't hold a grudge. In fact, she found herself drawn to Brian. Heather enjoyed having Brian around, especially when he did things for her. She wasn't mean, at least not in her mind. She prided herself on being involved in various causes, from save the ants to help the starving aardvarks. The contradictions never seemed to occur to her. What Heather did know, however, was that she had her future mapped out, and Brian seemed like a key piece of the puzzle. She wanted a husband who could provide for her and their future children, someone decent-looking, but more importantly, someone she could control. Growing up, Heather had watched her father run their household. It wasn't a bad childhood, but she knew she wanted to be the one in charge of her future family, not the follower. With a determined approach, she set her sights on Brian, and by the time they were ready to graduate, she had molded him into the kind of man she wanted. A yes dear, no dear, whatever you say dear shell of his former self. Every decision Brian made, every thought he had, ran through the filter of whether or not it would make Heather happy. Not long after they were married, Heather decided it was time to seal the deal by starting a family. Brian was blissfully unaware that they had moved from enjoying newlywed intimacy to being in full-on baby-making mode. While he thought they were just having fun, Heather was carefully charting her basal temperature and timing everything perfectly. When she finally got pregnant, she told Brian it must have been an accident. Maybe the condom failed. She delivered the news with a bite of her lip and the big doe-eyed look husbands everywhere recognize. Their first son, Ross, was born, followed by Jason 2 years later. Heather stayed home and embraced her role as a mother, while Brian took on more responsibilities at work. As the years went on and Brian's family grew, so did his financial obligations. Around the same time, both EMI and Brian realized that, while he wasn't the kind of worker to make waves at the factory, he was a genius when it came to field work. It was as though the machines talked to him, telling him what was wrong before he even touched them. Brian became EMI's top field technician. Unfortunately, there were a lot of CAT systems out there, and the workload was crushing. Brian finally sat up, shaking off the haze of memories. This was his chance, an opportunity to escape the endless grind and take control of his life. His friend had painted an exciting picture where Brian would oversee all the fieldwork and equipment support, while his buddy handled the business side and the parts warehouse. It felt like the perfect partnership, a dream come true. With renewed energy, Brian hopped out of the car and practically bounced up the walkway to his front door. "Guys, I'm home, and I've got some great news," he called out as he stepped inside. His voice was filled with excitement, but it wasn't long before he noticed something off. Heather emerged from the kitchen, her expression tight with concern. In her mind, something was stirring. Brian wasn't acting like himself, and that was unsettling. Change was not good, not for her. Maintaining control was what mattered most. Brian, oblivious to Heather's growing apprehension, eagerly gathered his family in the living room. He could barely contain his excitement as he shared the news about his friend's offer, speaking rapidly, not noticing the lackluster reactions around him. He explained how he'd be a partner in the business, not just another employee, and how they'd have to move to a vibrant new city. He even mentioned that they could afford a bigger, nicer house. But slowly the realization hit him. His excitement wasn't being mirrored by his family. Finally, Heather cut in sharply. "No, I'm not moving to another city. When we move, it will be after the boys are in college, and we'll be going to Sherman Oaks, where all the important people live. That's where I want to be." Jason chimed in, "Yeah, Dad, I like my school and my friends. Moving isn't fair to me. I'd have to start all over." Then Ross added, "Seriously, Dad? I just made varsity football in my senior year. Becky and I are going steady after I gave her my Letterman jacket, and we're going to the fall formal together." As the boys piled on their complaints, Heather quietly slipped away to the kitchen, satisfied that they were wearing Brian down. Returning, she dealt the final blow. "Brian, it's settled. You're going to tell your friend it was a kind offer, but you can't accept. Next time, consult me before you make promises you can't keep." A slight smirk appeared on her face as she added, "Besides, do you really think you're good enough to be a partner? I mean, you've been in the same position at EMI for 15 years. If you were that talented, wouldn't they have promoted you by now?" Brian clenched his jaw, seething with words he didn't dare say. He wanted to scream that he had turned down promotions and better jobs because he didn't want to uproot his family, the very thing they were now using to trap him. Heather glanced at him, noticing his reddening face and tight grip on his frustration. "Go wash up, Brian. Dinner's ready, and it's time to put this nonsense to rest." Dismissing him with a wave, she turned her back and called to the boys. "You two, come to the table." Brian, deflated and defeated, followed her command while Heather, clearly triumphant, practically floated back into the kitchen, her control over the household more solid than ever. Dinner was a quiet affair. Brian simmered in silence, the boys gobbled down their food, and Heather indulged in more wine than her meal. When they were finished, Ross and Jason made a hasty exit, leaving their mess behind. "Bye, Mom!" they shouted as they rushed out the door. Outside, the two brothers exchanged smirks. "Wow, did Mom ever tear into ATM tonight?" Ross snickered. "She totally put him in his place. She's got him so whipped that if she said jump, he'd ask, 'How high?'" Jason chuckled, but there was a flicker of concern. "I didn't want to move either, but don't you think Mom went a little too far? What if Dad gets mad and leaves?" Ross just laughed harder. "Dad? Please. He's not going anywhere. He knows he'll never find someone as hot as Mom, especially who'd put up with his fat ass." Jason grinned, but still felt uneasy. "Yeah, I guess you're right. He is kind of a loser. But at least he's got a big wallet." Ross nodded. "You said it. Worthless at everything except making money." Hey, maybe we can talk Mom into getting us that new car this summer, if he works a few more hours. With a high five, the two boys parted ways, their laughter echoing as they disappeared into the night, leaving behind the home and the man they had come to mock. The thing is, power corrupts, and the more absolute that power, the greater the corruption. Poor Heather fell a victim to just that over time. As her grasp over Brian got stronger, she began to perceive herself as superior, believing her desires and needs overrode everything else, including Brian's, their marriage vows, and even their family. What had started as a need to be the stronger partner had somehow transmogrified into the belief that Brian existed solely to serve her whims. Heather had started spending more and more time with her divorced friends, who were regaling her with tales of their independence, casual flings, and so-called empowerment. Heather had not stopped to question if the stories were embellished, or if their attitude had been a reason for the multiple divorces. She had just digested all that they called their philosophy on the superiority of women and freedom from total control. These ideas slowly but surely fed into Heather's self-centered nature. She began to envision herself in full control of Brian, emotionally, financially, and even sexually. While she was in a position of control in their intimate life, shutting down Brian's advances on more than one occasion, it was her girlfriend's rhetoric of a new order for women that gave her a warped sense of justification, that the control she wanted took root deeper within her mind. With these thoughts, Heather allowed her fantasies to go to domination. She shivered, hugging herself tightly, lost in her thoughts and daydreams. Yes, things were going to change even more, and she couldn't wait. Meanwhile, Brian was still angry about how his family had poo-pooed his news months previously. The decision to take up the offer kept nagging him, and he was getting increasing temptations to say yes. If only Heather would stand by him, things would eventually fall into place. He pulled into the driveway and noticed a car he had never seen in his usual spot. It wasn't any of their friends. Brian, confused, entered the house to find Heather seated on the couch with a stranger. "Brian, honey," Heather chimed in, the sweetness of her voice misleading. "This is Tyrell Jared Scott. He and I have something we want to talk to you about." The scene felt off right away. Heather sat too close to this Tyrell, their hands interlocked in each other. Brian's stomach did flips. His blood pressure started to climb. He could feel his ulcer flare up. "Brian," Heather went on to say, "Tyrell and I have been seeing each other for some time now, and we're tired of sneaking around behind your back." Brian's world was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, but Heather continued, wholly devoid of any shame. "Women need more than what one man can provide. It's natural, biologically. We're pre-wired like that. One man alone just can't fulfill a woman's needs. Tyrell and I, well, we are making each other happy, and that's just how it's going to be." Brian's jaw clenched, and his face red as anger took its toll. Heather noticed the rising tension in him and attempted to soothe it in her own twisted way. "Brian, it's not that I don't love you. I do. But you've been so exhausted lately. And let's be honest, it's not your fault you can't keep up. And, well, nature didn't exactly bless you in certain areas." Brian repressed his rage with great difficulty. His voice came out in low, trembling whispers. "Heather, what the hell are you talking about? Get this guy out of my house, and maybe you should go with him." Heather paid no heed to Brian's gathering ire and casually reached over, giving Tyrell's thigh a reassuring squeeze. "Brian, you really need to calm down. Tyrell is my guest, and he's not going anywhere. As a matter of fact, before you got all worked up, I was thinking about letting you join us in the bedroom tonight so you could see how much pleasure Ty gives me. But now, I'm not so sure you deserve that." Brian exploded. "Join you? Watch you? Have you lost your mind? I will not accept this. I will not have you screwing him in my house or anywhere else." Heather's face clouded and her grin went cunning. "Brian, you don't have a choice. Tyrell and I are going to keep doing this, and that's that." She stroked her hand over Tyrell's lap, and he bulged at her touch. Brian's anger had reached its peak. It was as if his life was imploding in front of him, and the woman he once loved had brazenly stood before him. What was once his home now felt foreign to him, overcome by Heather's warped sense of power. As it were, Tyrell's expression showed he was satisfied that the outcome pleased him. "Yo, man, I'm not here to steal your woman. She can stay here with you, eat your food, and do her thing. All I want is to have some fun with that fine lady of yours. No need for me to be dealing with all that drama, he said casually as he leaned back in his seat. Heather snuggled closer to Tyrell, looking at Brian with a "what's so wrong" expression. See, honey, Tyrell's not trying to take me away from you. You're still my husband, and I'll stay with you till death do us part. This is just a biological need. A woman has needs that sometimes require more attention than one person can provide. That was all Brian needed to hear. In a sudden rage, he shot from his chair, lunging at Tyrell. Before he could get close to him, however, it all went black. When Brian came to, he was lying on his back, his face pounding in pain. He drew his hands upward to his face, feeling the sticky warmth of blood on his fingertips. Moaning, he sat up, groggy. He was still in the living room, and Heather was still on the couch, but there was no sign of Tyrell. "I hope you're happy," Heather said icily. "Poor Tyrell hurt his hand on your face. He had to leave before he could finish what he came here for." Brian lurched down the hall into the bathroom. He grabbed the sides of the sink to steady himself, leaning forward and running cold water over his face to clean the blood off. He stared at his reflection. Could tell his nose wasn't broken, but his eye was swelling rapidly, the start of a very nasty black eye. Behind him, Heather's voice continued to drone on, berating him with her constant nagging about nature, how sex isn't love, and how things are just the way they are. Even counseling, anything to get Brian to understand. Hours later, Brian's head pounding, his vision blurred by the swelling, couldn't take Heather's voice anymore. Out of desperation, he agreed to go to counseling. He still had a small hope that she might see how deeply she was hurting. Not just him, but their whole family. It was not much of a hope, more like a flicker. Mostly, he had reconciled to the fact that his life was a nightmare, and he had merely crowned it all by marrying Heather. Heather was content with his agreement and wrapped her arms around his neck to try and kiss him on the lips. She felt alive. Brian was back in line. Heather knew he was angry, but she also knew he would do whatever she said he should eventually do. All she had to do was offer him that bit of affection, and he had turned into the compliant man again that she had molded. But Brian turned his face away, letting her kiss his cheek instead. Inside, he was still boiling with anger, both from the emotional wounds and the physical pain. There was no way he was going to give in to her this time. That's exactly how he'd ended up in this mess. Before the day was out, Brian had been able to contact his friend Howard, a paralegal at Grabham, and Hardy. Howard got him in contact with one of the partners, Patrick Hardy, who granted to meet with Brian the next day. At noon the next day, Brian sat in Patrick's cluttered office, explaining his situation. Patrick, a man who had done justice to his name, for whom the word tired seemed to have been invented, listened intently before pushing up his thick glasses to address Brian. "All right, I think I've got a good handle on your situation," Patrick said. "Now, let me be blunt about this." He looked over his glasses at Brian. "You're in a tough spot. Really tough. Your wife will fight the divorce every step of the way, and the system isn't exactly going to be kind to you." Patrick leaned back in his chair and exhaled loudly. "She's probably going to end up with the house, the cars, half of your assets, and half of your retirement. You'll be paying alimony and child support, and you'll be financially responsible for your boy's college. If you are lucky, you will not be living in a cardboard box under a bridge, praying for a heart attack." Brian left the conference room feeling more defeated than when he came in. Coming home on a Monday evening, Brian entered an uncommonly quiet house. No one was found downstairs, and he went up to change in his bedroom. As he approached the door, he distinctly heard his wife's moans down the hall. The pleasure in her voice was all too familiar. With her came deep grunts, those Brian instantly recognized to be belonging to Tyrell. Just as Brian was reaching for the doorknob, ready to confront the two, a voice from behind stopped him in his tracks. "What you doing here, white boy?" Brian spun around and was met by this towering figure, a 6'4" wall of muscle. "This is my home. What the hell are you doing in it?" Brian demanded, his anger boiling over. The stranger chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "So, you're the cuckold Tyrell told me about. Name's Jamal," he said, offering his hand as if this was a normal introduction. Brian stared up at him in utter incredulity. "Why the hell would I shake your hand?" he exonerated, long since past his patience. "I want you and Tyrell out of my house. Now." Before he could utter another word, everything went black. Brian came around some time later, the house silent and dark. His head pounded, his mouth tasting of blood from teeth seemingly loosened. Cleaning himself up, he trudged downstairs to the fridge, extracting a beer. Passing the den, the glow of the TV caught his attention. Heather sat watching, the volume barely audible. When she heard him, she looked up. "Brian," she said, patting the cushion next to her, "come sit with me." Brian moved a little farther into the room but didn't sit. "I'm sorry," Heather said softly, almost in a whisper. "I shouldn't have had both Tyrell and Jamal over while you were so close to coming home. Ty came over right after you left to work, around 9, and we spent time together until Jamal showed up around noon. I must have lost track of time. I won't do it anymore." Brian's face turned hard. "So now you admit you won't be with them anymore?" Heather smiled wryly. "No, silly. What I'm trying to say is that next time, I'll have a better plan so that you don't barge in on us." Brian's patience had reached a breaking point. Why would I want to continue living in this nightmare? Heather was cool, even with an undulating smile. "Because, dear husband, if you leave me, you will still pay everything that you make to me, but I will still do what I want to with Tyrell and his friends." And the argument went on, round and round, almost all night. Heather kept suggesting that Brian needed to open his perspective and went so far as to offer to attend counseling to help him see the reality of the situation. Brian, in return, kept saying that he didn't want her sleeping with anyone else. Finally, exhausted and just to appease her, Brian agreed to go see a counselor, though he didn't really think anything would be different. A few days later, upon arriving at the counselor's office, Brian felt a little nervous. The walls in the reception area were adorned with certificates from groups like Women Against Misogyny and Coalition of Undocumented New Age Transcendentalists. Behind the desk sat a gray-haired receptionist who reminded Brian of a bulldog, neither friendly nor inviting. "Dr. Gibbs will see you soon," she said briskly. Brian knew that this wasn't going to go well. Everything seemed to him contrived, almost scripted, but he had no notion of what the script was or what his part in it was. It wasn't until some 20 minutes later that a door finally opened, and out came a middle-aged woman with graying hair and an air of one in charge. Tight, pulled skin told of recent cosmetic work, adding to the natural unnaturalness of her expression. "Hello," she said with contrived gladness. "I'm Dr. Melanie Gibbs. Please come in." She whisked them into her office without an apology for the wait. Brian found himself thinking Heather didn't seem the least bit annoyed, a fact that furthered his suspicion that the wait had been part of some larger scheme. When they had been seated, Dr. Gibbs asked them to state what they'd hoped to accomplish from the sessions. Brian spoke briefly. He was feeling more and more out of place with each passing minute. Heather used a well-rehearsed version of her needs. With that, the counselor went into a speech that sounded like the replay of what Heather had been preaching for weeks. "So, Brian, it's not that Heather wants to cheat. It's that you've been unable to provide one of the most essential needs in life satisfying her physically." The words hit Brian like a punch in the stomach. It seemed this session, like everything else lately, was stacked against him. "In your words, you admit that you work long hours and are not available when Heather needs intimacy," Dr. Gibbs said calmly but firmly, while underscoring her points. "You should be grateful she's found a way to have her needs met while still keeping you in her life. That's what a loving relationship is all about. She is compromising her natural, biological desires to accommodate your selfish expectations." Brian had long since tuned out. His head pounded from the frustration, and the burden of the futility he felt overwhelmed him. He knew only when the session was over, and he was walking out to the car with Heather, that his mind was numb, battered by the unending swirl of blame and guilt being foisted upon him. After 3 more sessions of basically the same pattern, Dr. Gibbs always siding with Heather, insisting that Brian was the problem, he finally reached his breaking point and told Heather that he was done with their current counselor. "If we have any hope of saving our marriage, we're going to see someone I choose," he said. Heather smirked to know the best, as she agreed that no matter which therapist they went to, it would all come to the same conclusion, since they all saw it her way. One night, defeated and exhausted, Brian found himself at a bar. He did not even have the urge to go home, knowing full well that Tyrell was probably there with Heather. He had already downed 2 beers and was contemplating a third when the door to the bar opened. A man came in, sat a few stools down, and ordered a martini. He looked around the room a little, and his eyes landed on Brian. "Hey, buddy, can you pass the nuts down here?" Brian didn't seem too interested, nudging the bowl of peanuts towards the stranger. "Here," he grunted. The stranger continued to watch Brian a moment longer before asking, "You look like someone who's had a rough day. What's going on, man?" Brian immediately wanted to tell the guy to mind his own business, but didn't have the energy. He said nothing while the bartender set the man's drink in front of him. "Let me guess," the stranger said after taking a sip from his drink. "Either you just lost your dog, or you found out your wife's cheating on you." Brian looked up, tired of holding it all in. "It's the second one," he whispered. The man, who had introduced himself as Dean, gave a sympathetic look. "Sorry to hear that, Brian. You want to talk about it? I can't promise any solutions, but I can listen." Maybe the liquor was loosening his tongue, or maybe the stranger seemed sincere in an offer to listen. But Brian found himself telling Dean everything. How his marriage had spiraled right into a nightmare, how Heather's behavior had pushed him to the edge, and how powerless he felt in the face of it all. When Brian had finished, Dean gave him an old-fashioned stern look. "Sounds like you're in one hell of a spot, that's for sure. So, what are you going to do?" Brian laughed bitterly. "What can I do? The system's rigged against me. Everyone says it's a man's world, but let's face it, we gave it away." An eyebrow rose on Dean's face as a smirk played at the corners of his lips. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, slapping it on the bar in front of Brian. "I was in a situation like yours a couple of years ago. This guy helped me find a way out. He's good at what he does. What do you have to lose?" He stared at the card for a very long time, turning it over in his head, before he finally reached out and picked it up, slipping it into his pocket. Dean nodded and was out of the bar, leaving Brian to his thoughts. Eventually, Brian decided to return home to his house, which barely felt like a home anymore. He entered the house and, after the long exposure to alcohol, collapsed onto his couch into a deep, fitful sleep. Heather didn't check on him, satisfied to go to bed, as if she did not care either way. Brian woke up the next morning with a headache. Dry mouth tasted like something died in it. Every bit of him ached, including his head. He went to the bathroom, stumbling to freshen up. The events of last night swam in his mind. He stood in front of the mirror and knew he couldn't live this way anymore. Somehow, one way or another, this hell had to be over. Brian had suggested to Heather that they try a counselor named Zarek Stravensky. She gave him a look as though he were some kind of odd specimen under a microscope. "Zarek Stravensky?" she repeated with disbelief. "What kind of name is that?" Brian, however, stood firm. He wasn't going to budge this time. Finally, after a long silence, Heather relented. "Fine," she said with a sigh. "I'll look into him and let you know." The very next day, Heather reached out to Dr. Gibbs for her opinion on this Zarek character. The moment she mentioned his name, Dr. Gibbs's tone turned sharply critical. "Zarek Stravensky? He's a quack. He doesn't follow any of the accepted rules of therapy. He makes up his methods as he goes along." Thanking Dr. Gibbs, Heather hung up, but she was left feeling uncertain. Where on earth had Brian found this man? And why was he so adamant about seeing him when he was completely against their current therapist? The more Heather thought about it, the more unsettled she became. She had almost everything she wanted: a compliant husband who earned a good living, lovers who provided all the intimacy she desired, and, most importantly, total control over Brian. All she needed now was one final tweak to get him fully in line. Maybe, she thought, she could work some charm on him that night. Despite her efforts, which included rare intimacy and even a mercy round of sex, Heather couldn't shake Brian's determination to see Zarek. 3 weeks later, the couple found themselves walking into Zarek Stravensky's office, much to the dismay of Heather's friends and other local therapists, both male and female. No one seemed to like how Zarek operated. The issue wasn't just his unconventional methods, but also his lack of traditional credentials. He didn't have a PhD or even a degree in any of the social sciences. Instead, he held advanced degrees in chaos theory, mathematics, and physics. And he had passed the state exam to become a licensed marriage counselor. But his reputation spread mainly by word of mouth. There were no listings in official directories, just a small ad in the local paper. Wife cheating on you? Life shitting on you? Counselors blaming you for everything? Call Zarek Stravensky at 333-333-3333. When Zarek finally entered the room through a side door, He waved Brian and Heather toward two chairs angled slightly toward each other. He settled into his own seat and offered them coffee, which they both declined. Zarek then poured himself a cup from an ancient-looking percolator into a worn, handleless mug. Leaning back in his chair, he began speaking. First, let me remind you both, I'm not a traditional marriage counselor. I'm not here to fix your marriage or your relationship. I'm what you might call a life strategist. My expertise is in chaos theory. And as far as I can tell, marriage is about as chaotic as life gets, he said with a small smile. What I do is create a profile for each of you, figure out how you're interacting, and then give my recommendations. That might mean reconciliation, or it might not. Is that clear? Great. Now, you're here because Brian requested this, and I'm going to approach this as Brian's advocate. Just remember, a friend helps you with what they think you need, which isn't always what you want to hear. He paused, then looked at both of them. I understand you have children? Brian and Heather nodded. How many and how old? Zarek asked. Heather answered, We have 2 sons, Ross, who is 17, and Jason, who is 15. Zarek leaned forward slightly, raising an eyebrow. And where are they? Heather hesitated, then explained that their sons were just teenagers and that the problems in their marriage didn't involve the boys. Zarek didn't seem to agree. No, he said firmly. At 15 and 17, they're adults in almost every way that matters, except legally. They're part of this family, and they're impacted by everything that's happening here. I'll need to meet with them as well. He stood up, signaling the end of their session. Please schedule a follow-up appointment for the boys with my assistant on your way out. Heather glanced at Brian, feeling as though she had lost control of the situation, something she wasn't used to. But for the first time in a long time, Brian felt a small glimmer of hope. Brian, Heather, Ross, and Jason were all gathered in Zarek Stravinsky's office, 2 weeks after their individual interviews. Brian felt anxious, uncertain about what was to come, while Heather, on the other hand, appeared calm, smirking to herself. She was convinced that she had won Zarek over during her sessions, sure that he would validate her worldview and dismiss Brian's futile attempts at regaining control of their marriage. In her mind, this would be the final nail in the coffin of Brian's resistance. Maybe, she thought, if he groveled enough afterward, she'd reward him with a mercy sex. Better yet, let him clean up after Tyrell's latest visit. Ross and Jason sat in their chairs, disinterested, playing on their smartphones. Tonight's curry night. Can we stop at the Laughing Elephant on the way home? Jason asked with a sly grin, aware that his dad wasn't too fond of spicy food. Ross chuckled at the inside joke, both amused at the idea of tormenting their father, whom they mockingly referred to as ATM behind his back. Just then, Zarek entered the room, his eyes scanning the group before he sat down behind his desk. He opened a folder and skimmed through it briefly before looking up. All right, he began. I've done the interviews and I've conducted some independent research. He paused as he saw the look of surprise cross their faces. What? You thought I would just take your word for everything? No. I have my own ways of finding out the truth. People who dig deeper. Now, let's get started. Heather's smile faltered. The mention of research unsettled her, and the idea that Zarek had investigators poking into her personal life rattled her more than she let on. Her friends had warned her that Zarek was unconventional, but this was unexpected. Still, she assumed her manipulations would hold. Zarek, however, wasted no time. He turned to Heather and spoke bluntly. Heather, you're a self-centered, immature woman whose every decision revolves around your own comfort and pleasure. You provide no real support to your husband, financially, emotionally, or otherwise. You spend money recklessly, expecting Brian to work even harder to meet your demands. Your views on marriage and fidelity are delusional at best. You parade your superiority over men, believing you're entitled to multiple lovers, but in reality, you're nothing more than a selfish opportunist. He rubbed his temples and continued, You've convinced yourself you're enlightened, but all you've done is live like a spoiled child. Heather, you're acting selfishly, thinking you're above everyone else. Heather's face paled, and she stared at Zarek in disbelief. She had not expected this level of direct confrontation. Zarek shifted his attention to Ross and Jason, who had been chuckling under their breath until now. As for you two, he said, you're narcissistic, self-indulgent brats who treat your father as nothing more than a money machine. You have no respect for him or the sacrifices he's made for this family. You don't even think he's worthy of dreams or aspirations of his own. You've reduced him to an ATM, and that's all you care about. What he can give you. Ross's face turned red with fury. No one had ever spoken to him like that, and he wasn't about to let it continue. He shot out of his chair, fists clenched, taking a threatening step toward Zarek's desk. Without a word, Zarek calmly reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a large revolver, placing it on the desk and aiming it directly at Ross and Jason. His voice remained calm, almost emotionless as he spoke. "Son, you may be bigger, stronger, and younger than me, but if you take one more step toward this desk, I'll assume you're a threat to my life and use this to stop you. Are we clear?" Ross's confidence crumbled in an instant. His fists loosened, and he slowly sank back into his chair, eyes wide. Jason, already looking pale, sat frozen, trying to avoid any further attention. Zarek turned to Brian, who sat quietly watching the chaos unfold. "And you, Brian, you're a doormat. You've lost any sense of self-identity or esteem, running yourself into the ground to meet the ridiculous demands of your wife and children. They don't love you, Brian. They love what you provide for them. They're using you. On your deathbed, they'll be there, not because they care, but because they'll want to make sure they're the first to get what's left." Brian swallowed hard, the truth of Zarek's words hitting him like a punch to the gut. Zarek leaned forward and continued. "My recommendation, Brian, is to get as far away from these toxic people as possible. Don't file for divorce. You'll lose everything to the court system. Move out, pay the bare minimum to meet your legal obligations. Keep up the mortgage, taxes, and utilities, but nothing more. No food, no extras. Let Heather get a job if she wants luxuries. Ross and Jason can get jobs too. Separate your finances immediately before Heather drains what's left of your savings. She's probably already siphoned money into her own account, hasn't she?" At that, Heather shifted uncomfortably in her seat, confirming Brian's worst fears. "Does she own her car outright?" Zarek asked, looking directly at Brian. Brian didn't answer immediately, but Zarek already knew what was happening. He had seen it all before. Families driven by selfishness and manipulation, leaving one member to carry the entire burden. Now, he just had to wait and see what Brian would do with the truth. Brian nodded in response to Zarek's question. "Is the car in her name?" Zarek pressed. Again, Brian nodded. "Good. Cancel her insurance," Zarek said firmly. "She can either pay for her own or take the car off the road." Zarek then turned his attention to the boys. "Do Ross or Jason have cars?" Brian shook his head no. "Perfect. Don't get them one either. And if they ever take yours out without permission, report it stolen. Let the law deal with it. Oh, and there's no more talk of financing college for them. If they want to go, they can figure out how to pay for it themselves." Zarek's voice grew more resolute. "Finally, Brian, my best advice to you is simple. Move out. Take that job offer from your friend if it's still available, and put as much distance as you can between yourself and these leeches. Save yourself." Zarek reached into his desk and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it across the desk. "This contains all the legal paperwork you'll need to separate your finances, file for a legal separation, and begin proceedings to recover the money she's already taken. Just fill in the blanks and take it to the county clerk's office. Good luck." As Brian took the folder, Zarek added, "Oh, one more thing." He casually picked up a piece of paper from his desk, scanning it. "It seems that a certain Tyrell J. Scott had a bit of a tragic accident this morning. Apparently, he slipped in the shower multiple times. The doctors at Rockford Memorial don't think he'll make it. During the accident, he sustained severe injuries in a very delicate area, leading to significant blood loss. Poor guy." Zarek didn't stop there. "And Jamal Franklin? Well, he was struck by a bus last night while crossing Cedar Lane. Apparently, he decided to stop in the middle of the intersection to tie his shoelaces. The bus was going over 45 miles per hour, and with the driver's statement and 2 eyewitness accounts, the police ruled it an accident." The room was filled with stunned silence. Heather was hunched over, sobbing into her hands, while Ross and Jason sat frozen, fear and shock written on their faces. They had never been spoken to like this, never been forced to confront the reality of who they had become. As for Brian, he was in a state of disbelief. But for the first time in years, it wasn't because someone was placing the blame on him. Zarek had articulated what Brian had been too afraid to admit for so long. Someone finally saw things clearly, and didn't hold Brian responsible for the chaos that had consumed his life. Grinning, Brian reached out and vigorously shook Zarek's hand. "Thank you," "Thank you," he repeated, as if Zarek had just saved his life. With renewed energy, Brian jumped up from his chair and hurried out the door, already pulling his phone from his pocket. Heather watched him leave, her mind spinning as she realized Brian was serious. He was going to follow through on Zarek's recommendations. Zarek glanced at the three remaining in the room. His gaze was as sharp as ever. "Heather, you better get off your lazy ass and find a job. You're going to need an income to support yourself and those two," he said, nodding toward Ross and Jason. Turning to the boys, he added, "And you two, if you haven't figured it out yet, the gravy train has left the station and neither of you is on it. I doubt you've got the grades to pull off any scholarships, but you better start thinking about other options." Reaching into his desk once again, Zarek handed them two much thinner folders. "These are lists of trade schools around the state. I've also included contacts for the military recruiters here in Rockford, though honestly, I don't see either of you cut out for the service. Jason," he said, fixing the younger boy with a stare, "you need to stop living in your brother's shadow. Find your own identity before you waste your life being his flunky." With that, Zarek returned to scribbling notes on his papers, paying them no further attention. After several minutes, he finally looked up again. "You're still here? Is there something else you need? No? Then get the hell out." As they stood, Zarek called after them, "Oh, and Heather, since Brian's already left, make sure you pay my bill on your way out. Try skipping it today, and I'll have the cops on your doorstep tomorrow. Have a nice day." And with that, Zarek returned to his work, dismissing them completely.